Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a topic that is, unfortunately, incredibly pervasive and complex. Violence in families and violence directed at individuals based on their gender.
Yeah, it's everywhere, isn't it? Often hidden, but the impact is just huge.
Mm.
And it can feel so confusing from the outside trying to figure out why it happens.
Exactly. And while we know these things happen, understanding the why feels like such a crucial step towards actually addressing them. So this deep dive, we're going to explore the different theories experts use, right?
That's the plan. Using the insights from the sources you shared, we'll look at these different theoretical lenses, psychological, social, behavioral, systemic, to get a clearer picture.
Sort of getting past the headlines to the underlying patterns.
Precisely. To the dynamics that researchers have identified in family violence, FV, and gender-based violence, GBV, it's about understanding the forces at play.
And it seems like from the materials, even though there isn't just one answer.
No, definitely not a single magic bullet theory.
Right. But many of them seem to point towards this central theme of power and control being abused.
That absolutely comes up again and again. Its role might vary depending on the theory, but yeah, the abuse of power and control is often right there at the heart of it.
And we'll also see how some of these theories specifically help explain gender-based violence, too.
Exactly. So exploring all these viewpoints together should hopefully give us a much more complete, more informed perspective.
Okay. So where do we start this journey into the why? Which lens first?
Let's start by peering inside, looking at the individual's internal world.
Ah, the psychological stuff.
Exactly. The psychological makeup, early life experiences, that brings us to psychodynamic theories.
Okay, peering inside. So focusing on how those really early years shape us.
That's right. These theories really emphasize how those first relationships, especially with caregivers, can impact our psychological structures, our patterns, sometimes for life.
So first up in this area is object relations theory. What's the main idea here?
Okay, object relations. It suggests that our earliest relationships, particularly with our primary caregiver, create these sort of enduring psychological templates.
Templates, like blueprints.
Yeah, exactly. Like mental models of ourselves, of other people, and of how relationships are supposed to work. We internalize them, and they tend to stick.
Okay, so what happens if those early relationships were difficult? Or maybe needs weren't met?
Well, that's where problems can start. If those fundamental early needs weren't met consistently, or if there was rejection, neglect, abuse, it can lead to real difficulties later on.
Like what kind of difficulties?
Things like fragile self-esteem, trouble managing emotions, maybe chronic anxiety. And the sources suggest that this can sometimes show up as a really desperate, almost demanding search in adult relationships
A search for what?
to finally get those unmet childhood dependency needs fulfilled.
Okay. And is that how it connects to violence? Trying to get needs met, but in a really unhealthy way?
Yeah. That seems to be the link, yes. The source material suggests that, for instance, men who perpetrate intimate partner violence might have lacked adequate nurturing or felt rejected by parents early on.
And for victims.
Well, the theory proposes that some victims who stay in abusive relationships might be using internal defenses they developed way back in abusive childhoods.
Defenses that help them survive, then.
Right. But those same defenses become maladaptive in adulthood. They can make it hard to even recognize abuse or might lead them to unconsciously repeat familiar, even if destructive, relationship patterns.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah.
The survival tactics from the past hindering the present. Okay, building on that idea of early relationships, we also have attachment theory.
Yes, and this one feels quite intuitive for many people.
It does.
It focuses specifically on that deep emotional bond, the reciprocal tie between an infant and their caregiver.
And the quality of that bond shapes expectations.
Exactly. It helps form a working model in the child's mind about whether relationships are generally safe, reliable, trustworthy.
So what if abuse or neglect damages that bond?
Well, child abuse is a major disruptor. It's strongly linked to insecure attachment styles, avoidant, ambivalent, sometimes disorganized.
And these aren't just relationship quirks.
No, the sources are clear. These insecure styles are identified markers for later problems, social, emotional, even antisocial behavior.
So this really helps explain how violence can pass down through generations.
It's a powerful lens for that, absolutely. Attachment theory provides a pretty direct link, helping explain the perpetuation of maltreatment. Those insecure patterns formed in childhood are linked to difficulties forming healthy bonds later, increasing the risk.
Risk of repeating the cycle, either as a perpetrator or victim.
Yes, potentially both ways.
Okay. Then there's another psychodynamic view. Violence as trauma theory, viewing abuse as a kind of psychological wound.
That's a good way to think about it. It suggests experiencing abuse is processed, much like other traumatic events, similar to PTSD.
And this trauma affects how people process things later.
Profoundly. It impacts how future information is handled, how experiences are managed. It can lead to things like emotional numbing or being constantly on edge, hypervigilant.
The source mentions something about a compulsion to repeat the trauma. That sounds really counterintuitive and difficult.
It's one of the really challenging aspects, yeah. The theory suggests victims might unconsciously repeat the trauma emotionally, behaviorally, maybe even physiologically.
Why would that happen?
Perhaps because the abuse memories haven't been fully processed or integrated. The body's trauma response can get kind of stuck, overriding normal responses like fight or flight.
And that makes them more vulnerable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That state, where the system is sort of stuck reliving or reacting to past trauma, can seriously hinder their ability to protect themselves from future harm. It's a really tragic feedback loop described here.
Okay, so these psychodynamic theories really dig deep into the individual's past and inner world. Now let's shift focus, look outwards with social theories.
Right. These focus more on interactions between people, the social environment, and how behavior gets shaped by social context.
Control theory seems like a big one here, the idea that a core drive is getting and keeping power and control.
Absolutely. From this perspective, the main motivation for abuse in relationships is the abuser's need for power and control over the other person.
And they use various tactics.
Oh, yeah. Not just physical violence, threats, intimidation, coercion, isolating the person, controlling money, denying blame. It's a whole toolkit used to gain compliance and control how the other person thinks, feels, behaves.
And the person being abused is essentially forced to adapt.
They often have to modify their behavior, give up autonomy, really just to survive, to minimize the harm. And social support, or the lack of it, is crucial here.
How so?
Well, the sources highlight that having strong social support can make a huge difference in a victim's ability to escape or push back. Isolation makes it much, much harder.
That makes total sense. But the source also mentioned this theory explains why people aren't violent. That's an interesting angle.
It is. It suggests that while some are driven to control others, many people are themselves controlled by things like fear of punishment or strong bonds.
Like fear of losing their family or reputation.
Exactly. Men with strong family ties who fear negative reactions or the threat of arrest or losing their job or community standing, these act as controls, as deterrents against using violence. It's about what controls the potential for violence.
Okay, interesting. Resource theory feels kind of related, viewing violence itself as a type of resource.
It does. It sees force and violence as tools or resources someone can use to resolve conflict or get what they want, especially control.
And it suggests people with fewer other resources might use violence more.
That's the idea.
Mm.
Someone lacking wealth, social status, maybe strong verbal skills, they might resort to physical force more readily than someone with more ways to exert influence.
Then we have exosystem factor theory, bringing in external life stressors.
Right, things outside the immediate family, job loss, big debts, health problems, these can act as predictors of family violence.
But is it just the stress?
No, and that's the key nuance the sources point out. Stress alone usually isn't enough. It tends to lead to violence only when other factors are already there.
Like what?
Like a history of violence in their own childhood, low marital satisfaction, or being socially isolated. Stress might be the spark, but the kindling needs to be present.
Which ties right into social isolation theory.
Perfectly. Isolation is flagged as a really critical factor, especially in child abuse and neglect. You can't just look at the parents. You have to look at the neighborhood the community supports.
So isolated families in struggling neighborhoods are at higher risk.
Studies show exactly that. Worse family problems, higher rates of maltreatment in isolated families, especially in areas with social disorganization and few resources.
Okay. So we've looked inside, we've looked at social interactions. Now, learning and thinking cognitive behavioral theories.
Yeah, these focus on how aggression is learned, often through observation, and how our thoughts and beliefs contribute to violent acts. It's that interplay of thinking and doing.
Social learning theory is probably the best known one here, right? Learning by watching.
Absolutely. Bandura's work. The core idea is we learn social behaviors, including aggression and violence, by observing models, especially in our families and communities.
And behaviors get repeated if they're reinforced.
Right, if they work in some way, even if it's just getting temporary compliance or control. And the sources make a direct link here. Things like corporal punishment, while maybe intended differently, are associated with more aggression later, poor relationships, even future partner abuse. That's a really key finding.
And this is central to understanding that intergenerational cycle.
Fundamentally, social learning is a primary explanation for how violence gets transmitted. Kids exposed to violence, either as victims or witnesses, are much more likely to learn and repeat those behaviors.
The sources mention specific links.
Yes, research linking childhood abuse to later abusing one's own kids and witnessing father-to-mother violence to abusing one's own wife. The exposure normalizes it, teaches scripts for it.
Behavior genetics theory adds another layer to that, suggesting maybe a genetic predisposition.
It does. It suggests there might be some genetic influence towards aggression or antisocial traits, but, and this is crucial, it's not deterministic.
Meaning genetics isn't destiny.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The form aggression takes is still heavily shaped by the environment, stress, exposure, what's learned. It's seen as an interaction between heredity and environment fueling that generational cycle.
Okay. Reactive aggression theory seems to zoom in on the moment of violence itself.
Yeah, it focuses on the immediate sequence. Something negative happens, triggers a strong negative emotion like anger, leads to thoughts or urges to hurt someone, and then aggression follows unless it's somehow inhibited.
How does that help us understand, say, a specific outburst?
It helps unpack the process. It's linked to things like parental anger issues, certain discipline styles. It's also used to describe some batterers who react with sudden rage to perceived rejection, leading almost instantly to a desire to hurt their partner, followed by violence. It highlights the cognitive steps and potential for distorted thinking in that moment.
And lastly, in this cognitive behavioral bucket, learned helplessness. This tries to explain why someone might stay in a bad situation.
Right. Originally from animal studies, it was applied to humans who become passive after repeated failures to escape or change something awful. They sort of learn that nothing they do matters.
Applied to family violence victims.
Yes. It's been used to explain why some victims, like battered women, might seem passive or unable to leave after trying many times and failing, or facing worse violence. They might feel totally powerless.
It's controversial.
It is, as the source notes.
Yeah.
Because many victims absolutely retain agency, use survival skills, actively resist, or plan escapes. It doesn't capture everyone's experience. It's not a universal explanation for staying.
Okay, that makes sense. So, we've layered psychology, social factors, learning, and thinking. Now let's broaden out again into the family unit itself and how it interacts with bigger systems.
Right. These theories say you can't really understand an individual's actions, especially violence, without looking at their main context, the family system, and how that system connects to the wider world.
Family systems theory is key here, viewing behavior within the whole family's dynamics.
Exactly. It shifts from what's wrong with this person to what are the interaction patterns in this family. A core concept is interdependence. What affects one affects all, and vice versa.
And this helps see how patterns get passed down within the family.
Yes, it provides a framework for seeing how emotional issues, communication styles, behavioral patterns like violence get transmitted generationally inside the family system, and also how the family interacts with the community, schools, etc.
Family life cycle theory adds time and change to that system.
Right. It looks at families moving through stages, getting married, having kids, kids leaving home, aging. Each transition point brings stress as roles and dynamics have to shift.
And that stress can be a trigger.
It can increase the risk, yeah, especially if the family isn't very flexible or lacks good ways to cope and communicate through change. The sources specifically point out that separation or divorce is a particularly dangerous time.
A high-risk period for escalated violence.
A significantly high-risk period. That's a critical point for safety planning.
And within this systems view, there are microsystem factor theories looking at stress inside the family, like dependency.
Yeah, this is part of a bigger ecological model. Intrafamilial stress covers things like having more kids than you can really afford, overcrowding, caring for someone with a disability. These strain the family's resources, time, money, emotions.
Which can contribute to violence, especially combined with certain beliefs.
Exactly. Especially if combined with beliefs that support harsh discipline, for instance. And dependency relations theory fits right in.
Highlighting how dependency plays a role.
Yes, across different types. Child abuse kids are dependent. Elder abuse older adults might become dependent. Stressing caregivers. And spousal abuse economic dependency is a huge factor.
The lack of money making it hard to leave.
A major barrier. Victims may feel trapped because they can't support themselves or their children. And for immigrant women, the sources add, Fears about being in a foreign country, language issues, or cultural shame can make that dependency even worse.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground: psychological, social, cognitive, family systems, so many angles. Now, let's specifically focus these lenses on gender-based violence, GBV.
Right. GBV violence aimed at someone because of their gender identity. It's global,
Yeah.
mainly affecting women and girls, but also others who don't fit traditional gender molds. The scale is staggering. One source mentioned stats like 1 in 3 women in South Africa experiencing violence.
Just gives a sense of how widespread it is.
It really does. And it's not just physical.
Right. The sources mentioned domestic violence, sexual violence like rape and trafficking.
Economic abuse, controlling money, psychological abuse like threats, and manipulation. It takes many forms.
So how do the theories we've discussed help us understand why this violence is so often gendered?
We can draw pretty direct lines. Take social learning theory. Exposure to violence, maybe seeing it growing up, can normalize GBV as a way to assert power or solve conflict.
And as gender roles shift.
Exactly. As women gain more independence or power, some men might fall back on learned aggressive behaviors to try and reassert dominance they feel they're losing.
Attachment issues still factor in too.
Definitely. Childhood trauma, like witnessing violence, impacts those attachment styles. This can make it harder for survivors, even if they become more independent later, to break free from unhealthy relationship cycles because of those deep-seated patterns.
And that theme of power and control feels especially key for GBV.
Oh, absolutely central. The sources really emphasize it. Traditional gender roles, men dominant, women submissive, and patriarchal systems, those male-dominated power structures.
They create an imbalance.
A huge imbalance. Foucault's ideas on power are mentioned, showing how institutions can reinforce this. GBV functions, in this view, as a tool to enforce that gender hierarchy and maintain male control.
So when women challenge that hierarchy,
That creates tension, and some men may resort to violence to try and restore that traditional control. It connects directly back to control theory and resource theory, using violence as a resource to maintain power.
economic factors must be huge here too.
Highlighted as a major driver, yes. Women's economic dependence makes it incredibly hard to leave, while perpetrators often use financial control as a core tactic of dominance. It links strongly to resource and dependency theories.
What about cultural norms?
They play a role. Practices like bride price or child marriage can reinforce an idea of women as property, feeding into the power dynamics that enable GBV.
And the intergenerational aspect.
Applies directly. Exposure to violence across generations creates cycles, shapes attitudes about gender, about the acceptability of violence. It ties back to trauma theory, attachment, social learning, family systems. It's all interwoven.
Let's use that case study from source 2 to make it concrete. The wife becomes the main earner, husband escalates to abuse. How do the theories explain that?
It's a perfect example of convergence. Social learning. Maybe he learned. Violence is how men handle threats to status. Cognitive dissonance. The conflict between his belief, man provides, and reality, wife earns more, creates discomfort. Violence becomes a way to rationalize or restore his perceived role.
Attachment could play a role too.
Sure, if early trauma affects how he handles perceived threats to his power or self-worth. And critically, power theories see his actions as a direct attempt to use violence to reassert patriarchal control that's being challenged by her success.
That really shows how individual factors, learned stuff, societal norms, power dynamics all crash together in one situation.
Okay, so understanding these roots is vital. What about solutions, briefly?
The sources mention key areas. Prevention is huge. Primary prevention to stop it starting, changing norms, and secondary prevention like support and therapy for survivors.
Policy changes, strengthening laws and enforcement, definitely. Education is crucial too. Consent, equality, healthy relationships to challenge those harmful learned norms.
And economic empowerment.
Yes, that directly addresses the dependency factor. Helping survivors gain financial independence through job skills, financial literacy, it's critical.
It really feels like these solutions map directly onto the problems highlighted by the theories.
They do. Understanding the complex why across all these levels, individual, relational, social, systemic, is absolutely key to developing responses that actually work, that go beyond just reacting to crises.
Okay, let's try and tie this together. We've journeyed through these major theoretical lenses on family and gender-based violence, psychodynamic looking inward,
Social theories looking outward at interactions and control,
cognitive behavioral at learning and thinking.
and family systems looking at the unit and its context.
And the big takeaway seems to be it's complicated. No single theory holds all the answers.
Exactly. But together, they reveal the immense complexity. Violence isn't simple. It emerges from this mix of personal history, learned patterns, social pressures, economic realities, power dynamics, and systemic issues.
So for you listening, why does understanding all this matter? Well, it helps us see beyond just one awful incident to the deeper patterns, the risk factors, the root causes that researchers have painstakingly identified.
And that knowledge is powerful.
It really is. It informs how we might recognize warning signs, how we can support prevention, how we can advocate for effective responses, in our own communities or even globally.
It helps us move towards a much more informed view, seeing all the different dimensions.
Which leaves us with this final thought to mull over, something drawn from what we've discussed. Given how many of these theories highlight these deeply embedded intergenerational patterns.
Patterns of attachment, trauma responses, learned violence, power imbalances.
Right. So could it be that really focusing on addressing trauma, fostering healthy attachment, and actively challenging those learned power dynamics in this generation, is that maybe the most crucial step to actually breaking these cycles of violence for the next generation?
It really shifts the focus, doesn't it? From just managing the symptoms to trying to change the underlying conditions that let violence continue.
Definitely a lot to think about. Important, heavy, but essential knowledge. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive today.